Hi, it's Dr. Jerry Hizon. I'm a family and sports medicine doctor. And I like to start off this introduction to a ketogenic diet with Hippocrates' statement that let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. I want to teach you a bit about the history and some of the benefits of a well-formulated ketogenic diet. I've been in practice for quite a while, had a lot of good experiences, and I've been very excited over the last several years to introduce this nutrition program, which really dates way far back before we really had a lot of the misinformation and the various guidelines that don't work well. I kind of introduced the idea of biohacking your life. I know it sounds bad, but it's just a way of, can you improve your lifestyle? It's not just diet. In terms of the word diet in Greek actually means lifestyle. So it's not just the food you eat, the people you eat it with is important, when you eat it, what you don't eat, exercise, sleep, light environment, water, all of that takes into account a healthy life. But I like to think about the whole idea of the emperor's clothes. So we all know that fable where people were told a certain thing about the emperor, and at some point the little kid goes, hey, he's naked, like he called it what it is. I think you have to realize that we've had this 40-year experience where basically back in the 70s, they told us, you know, you really shouldn't eat a lot of fats. You should eat carbs. And this goes against over 100 years of science that talked about back in this Dr. Banting time where he actually wasn't a doctor, sorry, but he actually had the first book on corpulence or being overweight. And basically the premise of his book was stay away from starchy foods and eat healthy fats and you'll do well. And we did that for a long, long time. But then around the 50s, they started to change and to vilify fats. The problem is our wheat also changed too. So we think of the wheat of the Bible and remember it's give us this day our daily bread. But that was way different than the bread that we have now. The chromosomes were totally changed. And we have now the introduction in the last, say, 50 years of proteins like gluten and gliadin. And those dramatically affect how the wheat works for us. And the wheat is something that we don't realize, but it's actually an appetite stimulant. Have you ever been to a restaurant and the pretty waitress brings you bread? And you're thinking, oh, that's very nice of her. It turns out when you eat dough, you eat bread, you actually get hungrier. Essentially, it's an upsell. And as I kid, you don't take candy from strangers, even though my Boy Scouts taught me that strangers have the best candy and puppies. But we just don't take things for free, or at least be a little suspicious about it. But that's why they give you bread. Because it turns out bread will increase your blood sugar, increases then insulin, then you become hungrier and you eat more food. So there's three kinds of macronutrients. There's carbohydrates, there's proteins, and there's fats. And let's sort of go through them just to get a basis. So carbohydrates basically are the things that we love. They really are stimulating, they make us feel good, they're essentially our comfort foods. And I think you have to decide which is your fuel, carbohydrates or ketones. And ketones are when you burn fat. Now you would say, well, what about protein? Well, protein's really a building block. It's not really an energy source. And the challenge I have with carbohydrates is they come in a bunch of names. We call it carbohydrates, we can call it sugar, you can call it glucose. And in fact, there's 50 different names for sugar. And you could take sugar as sucrose or fructose, and then there's even the very bad high fructose corn syrup that has essentially been taken out of play right now. And then there's complex carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates with the thought that maybe the complex are better than the simple. When in fact, they're not significantly better. And they all raise insulin, and insulin is the hormone that stores fat. So the new paradigm is not to look at calories, but to look at your hormones, especially insulin. You keep insulin low, you keep your weight low. So the challenge with the unrefined or the refined carbohydrates is you get rid of the fiber and that truly spikes your blood sugar very quickly, which spikes insulin. So white bread and white rice, and there's been an increased consumption of both of these. Essentially, there's wheat in everything. And in fact, there's sugar in everything. And frankly, everyone has a sweet tooth. People say, oh, I have a sweet tooth. Everyone has a sweet tooth. It actually hits the same part of your brain that heroin and morphine hit. And in fact, there is a protein in wheat that's called gliadin. It exactly mimics morphine and heroin in terms of our wanting to eat it. So it's a very tough thing. When you go off of carbohydrates, you essentially go through a withdrawal. So the problem came in, though, is that in about the 1950s, a man named Ancel Keys did a seven-nation study, and there was a correlation that he found that if you increase your fat, you'll increase your heart disease. There's a big worry in the 1950s and 60s that heart disease was exploding. They didn't even consider that cigarettes were exploding. They decided to blame fats. And it turned out that he cherry-picked his 7 nations. He actually looked at 40 nations, totally excluding France, and he found this correlation, and he got them to be put into the guidelines. So McGovern in 1977 put in the food pyramid guidelines, and as you can see, the base of the pyramid is mostly carbohydrates. And during this time, they said, don't eat fat, eat a lot of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are safe, fats will kill you, and what we all need to do to get in better shape is just eat less and exercise more. And as Dr. Phil might say, how did that go? Well, unfortunately, in the last 40 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in obesity, in heart disease, obviously diabetes type 2, osteoarthritis, inflammatory diseases, and even diseases such as thyroid, celiac disease, acne, and arthritis. Diabetes is appalling. Diabetes is a horrible disease. It's the number one cause of blindness, number one cause of non-traumatic foot amputation. It's the number one cause of renal disease. Most diabetics die of heart attacks. It's a horrific disease. Type 1 is a lack of insulin, but type 2 is really a insulin resistance due to being exposed to chronic sugar. And obesity is tied to diabetes. In fact, we sort of kid that we call it di-obesity because they're sort of a chicken and egg. Do you get obese and then diabetic, or are you diabetic and you become obese? And all of this comes out of the thought that the calorie is the main thing when you're looking at what you should eat. We want to keep our calories low is what they told us. Well, what is a calorie? Basically, it's the amount of heat food, when you burn it, will give off. And we look at how much it, when it burns, raises the water temperature. And it's actually a very physical property. It's not even a biological property. And so in general, the thought is that there's all these ideas of what has caused obesity, and they thought we were just taking in too many calories. So let's eat less, exercise more, and we'll do well. If that's the case, why are the poor people the fattest? If you think about it, they have most of the manual labor jobs. And poor people usually have a lot, the kids have to walk to school. And it turns out that this has to do with the kind of food that they're given. So, and as you know, women are a bit heavier than men. That's not fair. As I kid, men have to announce if they're working, men at work, because women work all the time. So why is it that we have this obesity if we're just looking at calories? So in science, we have this idea of a hypothesis. And if you have a hypothesis that calories are the ones that cause obesity, but that doesn't seem to work, you have to think about maybe your hypothesis wasn't exactly correct. So, and I use that little concept. In the old days, we thought of the Earth, that the sun revolved around the Earth. And then we realized, nah, it's really the Earth goes around the sun. So we have to look at, when our hypothesis doesn't fit, could that hypothesis be wrong? And could we look at something else? Now, if you go back to ancient tribes, the hunter-gatherers actually did quite well. If you look at the Inuit Eskimos, the Maasai in Africa, and the Native Americans, the Native Americans of the plains, basically ate very little grains, ate mostly fat from animals, and actually were essentially free from most of the chronic diseases. I like this whole idea with Dr. Livingstone, who was the one that was in Africa, that when they looked at the Maasai, the missionaries looked at the Maasai, they were said to be lean and fit. The Maasai who ate mostly a low-carb, healthy fat diet, no diabetes, heart disease, obesity, cancer, tooth decay, or acne, and they ate the fattest parts of the food of the animals, and they did have carbohydrates, but they were seasonal. They were local, obviously raised, and they didn't have them off season. If these were ripe, they would eat them in season, and that worked really well. Now, the big question is, how did we get this so wrong? If all these ancient tribes got it right, how do we get it wrong? Well, there's powerful forces that are shaping our nutritional recommendations. Basically, what gets subsidized, it's kind of big ag, corn and wheat. And they're the ones that do a lot of the research, and they only publish what fits. So I got down this role with a Dr. Joe Sugar, who basically wrote this book, Lean and Fit. And he was the one that really introduced me to the concept of a low-carb, healthy fat diet, otherwise known as a ketogenic diet. And the person that really blew the lid off all of this approximately 10 years ago was Gary Taubes. And he wrote this classic book called Good Calories, Bad Calories, about why we get fat and what to do about it. And really sort of introduced the concept of insulin. So insulin is a hormone that controls your blood sugar, and it regulates fat storage, kind of like a freezer police. So if you have a lot of insulin from chronic carbohydrates, basically it's like a police officer that lets you put stuff into the freezer and won't let you take it out of the freezer. So a lot of us have a refrigerator and a freezer, and the freezer is always sort of hard to get to. And so basically if you run out of food in your refrigerator, you just go to the freezer and then you kind of resupply it. It'd be like us getting to our fat supplies. But if insulin's there, it doesn't let you. It only lets you put food in, it won't let you take it out. And in fact, insulin is a way to put on fat. They actually test sumo wrestlers, who are probably the fattest athletes out there, for insulin sort of doping, where they actually give themselves insulin just to get fatter. So insulin will make you fatter. In fact, this last picture on the bottom shows a lady who only injects her insulin in her anterior thighs. You can see she just has basically a bubble of fat that's right there. So interestingly, when you look at the whole idea of dietary fats, that there is not really a correlation between a low-carb, healthy fat diet and chronic disease. And that, in fact, it is safe. It actually raises your good cholesterol, and it raises it actually raises your HDL and lowers your triglycerides, which are very heart safe. So a low-carb, healthy fat diet is very heart safe. So that gets the elephant out of the room, number one. Number two is that you have to understand the concept of ketones. So ketones are the way our body uses fat in a way that allows it to be transported and actually can go up into the brain. Ketones are essentially water-soluble fats. They allow us to use it as a source of energy, and they are an alternative. And interestingly, there's a lot of benefits to this ketogenic diet. So think about our bodies also somewhat like a truck. So if you're a gas truck, they have two compartments. They have the little compartment of gasoline for the engine, and then they have a bunch of gas in the tank. It would be a little ironic to see a gasoline transport truck out of gas on the freeway, because they have a bunch of gas, they just can't get to it. So what we want to do is give ourselves metabolic flexibility. Can we use the fats that we have, and how do we do that? So there's a lot of foods that will raise insulin. Basically, it's the starchy, sugary foods. And then there's foods that are low in glycemic index, such as the coconut oil, olive oil, avocado oil, and butter, that essentially don't do anything to insulin. And so you can eat those and really do well and improve your insulin sensitivity. One of the best thought leaders in this is a Dr. Jason Fung. He is a nephrologist out of UCLA and now is in Toronto. He has shown in his intensive dietary management program, this patient, Margaret, basically was in her program. in his program for 3 weeks and essentially got off all of her insulin by a combination of a low-carb, healthy-fat diet with intermittent fasting, done under a doctor's supervision, which is what we highly recommend for converting diabetics from carbohydrates to a ketogenic diet. What about athletes? Is this a good diet for athletes? Most of the endurance athletes these days are turning to ketogenic diet. I've done marathons where you hit the wall because you run out of carbohydrates. If you eat carbohydrates, you have to eat them frequently, and even then, you only have a limited amount that you can do. With a ketogenic diet, you essentially have an amazing amount of energy, arguably unlimited amounts of energy, because we have so much fat, and fat does very well. So what about those patients or those animals that eat a lot of vegetables? They're not really happy. They're kind of always hungry. Think if you could just eat salad all the days. Think about what you know about herbivores. All the herbivores like cows and hippos, they're pretty overweight. Think about the carnivores that eat a little bit of the protein, but a lot of the animal fat. They're lean and fit. So I think it's important for us to figure out what is our best energy source and maybe look to the animals for a little bit of guidance. Now, to go back to the heart, you have to understand that a ketogenic diet will probably raise your LDL. But there's two kinds of LDLs. There's sort of a small, dense that is very dangerous and atherogenic, which means it causes heart problems. And there's a big, fluffy one. So think of it like a beach ball. If you're going to get hit with a golf ball or a beach ball, you probably want to get hit with the beach ball. So even though it raises the LDL, it raises the good LDL and has been shown to be heart safe. So a well-formulated ketogenic diet will increase your HDL and decrease your triglycerides. Very beneficial metrics for decreasing atherogenesis and heart disease. It may raise your LDL, but we encourage you to maybe get an MRI fractionated LDL to show that it is the good LDL that will not cause atherogenesis. And not that it actually starves cancer, but a low-carb, healthy-fat diet puts a big stress on cancer. And they've shown in several studies that you could decrease the amount of chemo and radiation. So it doesn't replace standard cancer treatment, but it may augment it and, in fact, a lot of ways be an adjuvant for the standard diet, because cancer, again, through the Warburg effect, can only run off of carbohydrates. It sometimes needs a little bit of glutamate. And if you can keep on a low-carb, low-protein, healthy-fat diet, you improve your chances with malignancies. They have some preclinical studies, and in fact, a very interesting one is the Keto Pet Sanctuary, where they have dogs from kill shelters brought to an area where they're on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and they have PET scans and CAT scans to look that they are reversing disease. So in the future, I think this will be part of our armamentarium against cancer. And a ketogenic diet is brain food. This is the Charlie Foundation. This is Charlie. And he was having seizures in the early 1990s. His father was looking all over for a solution because Charlie had already had surgery. He'd been on maximum medications. And when he found the ketogenic diet sort of in the back halls of Johns Hopkins, his seizures went away. They started a foundation that has been instrumental in showing the ketogenic diet is good for a number of therapeutic diseases, or can be used therapeutically for a number of diseases, especially seizures, but even with autism, even with Parkinson's, as I showed in another video about the use of it for Alzheimer's. And in fact, on the flip side, all of the best sort of memory experts go ketogenic just so that they can improve their brain function. And interestingly, this focus has been shown in a variety of different ways. You decrease your brain fog, we call it keto clarity. And in fact, all of Sweden went on a ketogenic diet. Not all of them, but a good portion of them. And they essentially halved their heart disease. To the point that their neighboring country, Norway, wanted butter. And there was actually this crime scene where they were caught smuggling butter into Norway because there was a butter shortage in Norway because they all wanted butter and there wasn't enough around it. And why is this? it turns out there's an inverse relationship between weight and the amount of butter you consume. If you look at the one graph, as it goes down, the weight goes down, the more butter that you eat. So it's a little bit seeming contradiction, but it's very, very exciting to know that there is data. There's 3 million people in Sweden that and they've been doing this for about 10 years, that it's very safe. In fact, it's very healthy, and it's very sustainable and doable. And then you add this with intermittent fasting. So the concept of fasting, frankly, we joke is the other F word, but fasting's been recommended by all the big three, Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad. And they all recommend fasting. Fasting is very healthy spiritually, also mentally, but also physically. And it turns out, as the joke is, you don't eat, you'll lose weight. With this diet of the ketogenic diet, you just don't get that hungry. You don't have the highs and lows. You don't get hangry. And so if you're on a carbohydrate-based diet, it's like having a fire with newspaper. You got to keep eating all the time. So that's why you got to get up early, eat, and then a snack, and then lunch, and then a snack, and then dinner, and then a snack. I mean, you're always eating, yet you're always hungry. Contrast that with a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and most people only eat lunch and dinner, and for a lot of people they do OMAD, 1 meal a day. So it turns out when we look at these ideas that in a lot of ways a ketogenic diet makes your life very simple. As Jason Fung joked about, if you're rich, you can fast. If you're poor, you can fast. You don't have time, you can fast. Fasting really complements your life as to adjusting your hormone level. And when you look at fasting, it could be anything from 1 hour to 1 day to 1 month. Again, it's not something you jump right into, but it is nice to know that it's what you eat, what you don't eat, and when you eat. And sometimes when you eat can be the most important thing. Now that I've talked about a lot of the positives of a well-formulated ketogenic diet, what are the negatives? Well, there's a lot to learn. It's not an easy diet to go on. It takes a conversion. There is something called the keto flu. When you go from carbohydrates to a well-formulated ketogenic diet, your body goes through withdrawals. Let's face it, sugar is a drug, just like any other withdrawal. If you're going to withdraw from something, it's going to be a little bit of an uncomfortable situation. When you go on a ketogenic diet, you actually urinate a lot more, and you urinate water, but also salt. So unless you really dramatically increase your water intake and salt intake, you'll get cramping, you'll get something called the keto flu for typically 5 to 7 days. And this is where we can help you to get through that. And once you do that, you now are on a ketogenic diet, but it's not something you just jump into. We like people to slowly learn about it. We do a slow carb and then the low carb, and we get them through the keto flu, and then they're okay. So again, to kind of recap, there's the standard American diet, which is basically a high fat but a high carb diet, and that's not been turned out to be very, very helpful, and actually in the opposite is very unhealthy. What we're not advocating is the Atkins diet, which is a low carb, high protein diet. That didn't work because too much protein becomes carbohydrate. South Beach diet basically had a bit too much carbohydrates to get you into ketosis, although it is a slow carb diet, and for many people that works out perfect. The Mediterranean diet, you have to understand that the true Mediterranean diet is a low carb, high fat diet, and it is something that is definitely attainable. So what a ketogenic diet looks like is most of the majority of your calories come from fat. 65 to 75% of the calories come from fat. Fat is very calorie dense, so you don't need that much fat to do that. You have moderate to low protein depending on how much you exercise. A paleo diet is a ketogenic diet with a lot of protein if you exercise a lot. CrossFitters do that a lot, and that's totally fine. And you have very low carbohydrates. I jokingly save my carbs for my Cabernet. You know, 1 glass of Cabernet is typically about 4.5 grams. So that's a lot of days the only carbohydrates that I get. So in summary, every day you kind of ask yourself, well, what should I eat? And I think you have to figure that out for yourself. We're all on a journey to find out what is our best diet. I like the idea of a well-formulated ketogenic diet, and keto standing for keep your carbs low, eat healthy fats, test so you know if you're in ketosis, and don't overdo protein because you definitely can do that. And we suggest dipping your toe in the water. Don't go all in. Think about a slow carb. And the slow carb diet would be no GPS, which stands for no grains, potatoes, and sugars, say 6 days a week, and then have a cheat day. And do that for a couple weeks until you basically get tired of being sick on your cheat day and you go into a ketogenic diet. Green leafy vegetables are great with a lot of healthy fats and oils. And try to not have food for 6 hours when you wake up. Let that be your intermittent fasting to keep your insulin low. So we're all on the journey to find out what is our best nutrition. There's a lot of resources out there. Jimmy Moore's very popular Living La Vida Low Carb podcast has been good. There's little apps like Lenny the Carb Counter. And I think you do have to question authority, like back in the 60s and 70s, where if things aren't making sense to you, perhaps we have the wrong hypothesis. And I'll end with a quote that has been sort of given, or at least referred to by Thomas Edison. And he says, "The doctor of the future will give no medication, but will interest his patients in the care of the human frame, in diet, and in the cause and prevention of disease." So here's to you, hopefully now being able to eat well, hopefully you'll move well and you'll sleep well, so that in the end you will be well. Thank you.